AAA gaming is slowly dying. It's been doing so for a long time. For many of us, it's almost been difficult to even feel excited about new release announcements anymore. That bright and hopeful excitement we used to feel after the first trailer fades as we realize that games simply won't meet those expectations on release. How did things get this bad in the first place? What happened to the talent of those once beloved studios? And more importantly, how is Helldivers 2 defying this trend? To figure out the answer to all these questions, we need to go back to the beginning. Okay, maybe we don't need to go all the way back to the beginning, but we should at least be looking at a time when new game reveals brought about excitement rather than jaded bitterness. A golden age of gaming, if you will. We are specifically looking at AAA games, however, so if we are to find our golden age, we first need to define what a AAA game is. A game is typically considered AAA based on three factors: the size of the developer or publisher, the development budget, and the marketing budget. One of the first games to be openly acknowledged as a AAA title is the much beloved Final Fantasy VII, which was the most expensive game ever made at the time in 1997. It cost about $45 million to develop, with a further $35 million spent on marketing. About $162 million in 2024 if you adjust for inflation. That's an incredible amount of spending for the day. Sources also claim it had approximately 120 artists and programmers working on it, which was also the largest game dev team at the time. In fact, the late 90s and early 2000s would set the stage for this sort of thing. Polyphony Digital's Gran Turismo in 1997 must have had a high budget to produce such detailed models for cars at the time, not to mention the cost of licensing with car manufacturers and Sony Computer Entertainment backing them as a publisher. 1998 would see Konami creating Metal Gear Solid with advanced graphics, for the day anyways, and cinematic presentation, all of which would require substantial resources. It started with a team of just 20 people with Hideo Kojima at the head and only one person working on the actual code, but the final credits would go on to include 173 people. Remember, Konami was already a solidly established publisher at the time, known for the critically acclaimed Castlevania series, Suikoden, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games. 1998 was a pretty big year actually, because it was also the year we saw Nintendo release The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, which was the first game in the series to feature 3D graphics. It was developed alongside Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64 with a budget of over $12 million and more than 200 people on staff. On PC, meanwhile, this same year, the Valve Corporation was releasing Half-Life, which would go on to be called one of the best games of all time. This is just an honorable mention, considering Valve was certainly not AAA with a small team of 20 people and no real budget to speak of. But we'll come back to them. Moving into 2001, we have Microsoft publishing Halo Combat Evolved, developed by Bungie with a team of about 60 people at its peak. Microsoft intended for this to be the flagship game to push the Xbox, so while we don't know exactly what the budget was, it's safe to say it was probably large, especially given that Microsoft first had to acquire Bungie a year earlier in order to achieve this. What they paid for Bungie, however, was never made public. Also in 2001, we have Grand Theft Auto 3 by Rockstar, the first 3D Grand Theft Auto game, and another title where the budget is a mystery to us. This was developed by a core team of 23 people in Edinburgh, cooperating with Rockstar Games in New York City. We'll be here all day if we go through all the games that helped define AAA gaming, so let's do a bit of a speed round. In 2002, we had The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, Warcraft 3 and Metroid Prime. In 2003, we had Command & Conquer Generals. In 2004, we had Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Half-Life 2, World of Warcraft, Halo 2, Doom 3, The Sims 2 and Fable. In 2005, we had God of War and Resident Evil 4. In 2006, we had Gears of War, The Elder Scrolls 4, Oblivion, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. In 2007, we had Uncharted Drake's Fortune, Bioshock, Halo 3, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, Assassin's Creed, Mass Effect, Portal, Crysis, Super Mario Galaxy Galaxy and Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars. In 2008 we had Grand Theft Auto 4, Fallout 3, Left 4 Dead and Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. In 2009 we had Batman Arkham Asylum, Assassin's Creed 2 and Borderlands. In 2010 we had Red Dead Redemption, Fallout New Vegas, StarCraft 2, Wings of Liberty, God of War 3, Mass Effect 2, Halo Reach and The Sims 3. Obviously there are loads more games that could be on this list, and that's just going up to the year 2010. Even then, it's difficult to classify what deserves to be called AAA in hindsight because game development budgets are usually not made publicly available. I know we've been including the size of publishers in this, but even that isn't always going to be a clear-cut indicator of AAA status. Take Fable, for example. It was published by Xbox Game Studios, so Microsoft, but it was developed by Lionhead Studios and their satellite studio Big Blue Box Studios. The wiki entry tells us it had 150 people working on it, and that's the principal reason I've included it as a AAA game. In addition to that, it was the darling project of Peter Molyneux, a man known for his success with Lionhead's other game Black and White. His presence was a mark that the project had a big budget behind it, and he certainly helped hype up the marketing, promising an experience unlike any other. Minecraft, on the other hand, released in 2009, was an indie game project created by one man, and not a AAA game by any means at all. It has since, however, become one of the most played games of all time, and now you probably could call it a AAA game after years of ownership under Microsoft, who continued to develop and update the game. Anyway, why did we stop in 2010? There have been a lot of great games since then, but 2010 was right around the time things were beginning to change. One of the most important factors affecting what's happening to AAA games is financial, and don't worry, we'll cover why in a bit, but first it's important to understand how the financial models of video games have changed over the years. It's not the most fun part of our hobby to talk about, but developing video games is a business, and in many ways it's a risky business, but it bears a lot of similarity to the movie industry. In both cases, you begin with an idea, then you find yourself a publisher with enough financial backing to support the creation of your idea, and the work begins. With either games or movies, that work could be happening for years before you even have something marketable, let alone a finished product. Even if you do finish it, there's no guarantee that people are going to like it, no assurance that you're going to get back all the money you put in. And remember, you're not just trying to recover costs, you actually want to make a profit from this after all. One of the best examples I can point to illustrate the risk in game development is Duke Nukem Forever. Although it was actually released in 2011, it was announced in 1997. I wish I was joking, but this game spent 14 years in development. If we get technical, we could say that there was definitely a period of time between then and the release where little to no development was actually taking place. And I wonder if this game would ever even have been released if the publisher, Take-Two at the time, hadn't actually sued 3D Realms for failing to finish the game. I'll skip the full story because you could write a whole essay on this game's development alone, but Gearbox eventually picked it back up and saw it through to its release. But we're looking at the business side of Duke Nukem Forever. The studio head sunk around $30 million of his own money into trying to finish the game. That money was never recovered. The publishers still made money at least. Duke Nukem Forever currently lists about $14 million gross revenue on Steam, and we know Take-Two didn't put that much into it, nor Gearbox in acquiring the title. This story simply serves to illustrate the risk you take in making video games. Duke Nukem Forever is one of the worst examples, but if you find yourself with a few $1,000,000 and you start considering game development as a business you might invest in, you would be wise to consider looking elsewhere. You might see that money bringing faster returns if you invested in retail, for example, rather than a product that would take time to release and potentially go nowhere. But that was part of the problem. You might spend all that time and all that money, and once you've made the game and released it, your only real option was to drop a couple of expansion packs for it or to go make another game. But what if you never stopped releasing expansion packs? This wasn't a new idea. Take The Sims 1, originally published as a spin-off of the SimCity games, developed by Maxis and published by EA in February 2000. The Sims was notorious for its expansions. Games like The Sims have never historically been cheap. It cost about $50 at release, which would be about $85 to $90 today when you account for inflation. Even though it was massively successful, its creators saw the potential to keep earning money from it and released the Living Large expansion pack in August the very same year for a cool $30 more. 2001 would see two more expansions, House Party and Hot Date, each of which was an additional $30. In 2002, The Sims Vacation and The Sims Unleashed would each demand another $30, and in 2003 we would see the last expansion packs for The Sims, Superstar asking for another $30, and Make and Magic would cheekily ask for $35, probably for its larger content offering. The combined $265 was a big asking price to see all the content a game had to offer, especially when you consider that that would be worth about $483 today. It's worth noting that you're obviously not going to reach as many people with an expansion pack as you would with a whole new game, but there were benefits to this method. Expansion packs released over multiple years would keep your game relevant for longer as it continued to gain media attention with each new release. People who had stopped playing the game might pick it up again, buying the new expansion for a fresh experience. And those who were still playing would likely want the new content anyway. Even though you were reaching fewer people with an expansion than with a new game, there would be considerably less risk involved, and it would also be quite a lot easier with most of the groundwork and code laid by the existing game. We know this method worked well because it was adopted by every Sims game thereafter. The Sims 2 went a step further and split off into regular expansion packs and stuff packs. The short story is that at their release prices, the total cost of The Sims 2 and all its extras was about $530. The Sims 3 would kick that up to $680, and The Sims 4, even though it has since gone free to play, is sitting at over $1,000 worth of expansion packs. Granted, they offer sales and bundle deals, but my point is, this model was a proven way to earn a lot more out of your game than you otherwise would, and much less work and risk than investing in a whole new game. In fact, no wonder it went free to play. Just look at the active player count change in October 2022 when that happened. A leap from 20,000 to 96,000 players, many of whom might consider buying into these pricey expansion packs. And these are just the numbers from Steam. This doesn't account for the people playing through EA's own app. The Sims isn't the only franchise staying alive and profitable this way either. Railworks was released to Steam in 2009. It got renamed a few times over the years, eventually settling on what is now Train Simulator Classic. This game targets an incredibly small niche. I guess if you're into trains, it's one of the few games out there actually trying to be a real simulator. But how does a 14-year-old game with an incredibly small player count stay alive over the years? With downloadable content expansions, of course. A lot of DLC. 741 of them, to be exact. The base game will cost you $25 and seems to come with a few of the DLCs, and there are packages to get some of them at discount prices, but some of the DLCs are nearly double the price of the game at $48. In fact, I ran the numbers for you, and buying all of these expansions will cost you a staggering $12,839. Now, pardon the pun, but we're getting a bit off track looking at games like Train Simulator. We won't judge them too harshly for those DLC because I don't think it's actually intended that any one player spend that amount of money to own them all. Far more likely, the intent is that each player purchases the exact package they're interested in, and having such a massive offering of content allows the developers to put it all into one main game and keep it alive over the years. But it is a pretty good proof that the DLC content model works if such a small game can enjoy such a long life off the sales. The newest ones were released only this year after all. Instead, we're going to be shifting our focus to games that took the concept of expansion packs and changed it into something else entirely. World of Warcraft will be celebrating a mind-blowing 20 years of life come November 2024, and it's easy to see how that happened. It was one of the first MMOs in the world to grow as large as it did, and of course it had to launch with a subscription model as this was the only way to offset the cost of running servers for the game in the long run. Not to mention the actual game upkeep and updates. But those updates didn't all come free. The game has had a number of expansion packs over the years, and to be perfectly fair to it, they've all been pretty major. It's not much compared to the subscription fee, and now it doesn't really matter anymore because all previous expansions are included as part of the base subscription. Bungie did something similar. It kept Destiny alive with a series of paid expansions and is still pulling that trick with Destiny 2, though they've also done something similar to The Sims in that they've gone free to play to encourage those content purchases. So what did World of Warcraft and Bungie do differently? I think we've come far enough on this topic that we can truly talk about the problem we have here. When you look at the list of AAA games we covered in the first part of this video, I think you'll see a common trend. In almost all of the given cases, with little exception, the interaction between a company and your wallet was pretty limited. You bought the game, you owned the game, you played the game. If it was good, you kept playing it. You told your friends about it. They bought it too. I don't feel like this needs much explanation. It's pretty much the same thing that's been true of any product or bit of entertainment that you consume. The folks responsible for making the game have to aim to make something good, because if it isn't and the word gets out, nobody will buy it and all the time and money invested in it will have been for nothing. So the primary concern of an individual or studio making a game and looking to profit from it in the past was, how do I make the game better? How do I make it more appealing? It was a win-win way of thinking, because it meant that companies would put their best efforts in to maximize profits, and we got a number of amazing games that would stand the test of time. But remember that I said something began to change around 2010? It's why we've been talking about expansion packs. If you extend the logic behind expansion packs, you end up with live service gaming. Wikipedia describes games as a service as a way to monetize games after their initial sale via continuing revenue model. Right off the bat, it's worth noting that not all live service games are bad. Every MMO or game that has online servers hosted by the developers or publishers is technically live service in some respect, and you obviously can't have an MMO at all without servers or a competitive shooter without matchmaking. But business is business. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise to you that businesses are always trying to cut costs, increase profits, and grow. In retail, we call it shrinkflation, when you pay the same amount of money for less or lower quality product. The company wins, of course, because they save massively on production costs with little effort, but the customer always loses. In the video games industry, something similar began to happen with the prolific spread of live service games. While large, massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft and RuneScape were some of the first live service games, a research analyst at the 2011 Game Developers Conference showed that it was actually the Chinese publisher Tencent who first began to experiment with mainstream live service games back in 2008 and 2009 with a game called Crossfire. To touch briefly on Crossfire, it's a Counter-Strike inspired first-person shooter made by the South Korean developer Smilegate and developed in South Korea in 2007. Tencent published it in China in 2008 and it made its way to the USA in 2009. By 2014, it was earning more revenue than any other free-to-play game in the world, and it was actually the world's most played game until League of Legends took its place in 2017. Incidentally, Tencent were the owners of League of Legends when this happened, as they brought the majority share in Riot Games back in 2011 and then fully acquired the company at the end of 2015. So Tencent beat Tencent in a way. Well done, Tencent, I guess. What's relevant here is that both Crossfire and League of Legends were monetized via microtransactions. The games themselves were free to play, the developers realized that making the game free would ensure a high player count, and having a high player count in turn meant that more people would see the in-game cash shop in both games. Tencent may have started it, but as much as it hurts me to admit it, it was actually Valve who really started to make microtransactions popular in online games and set the trend for doing so in the West. It started with Team Fortress 2 when Valve released the Manconomy update in 2010. This introduced an in-game cash store and the ability to buy keys to open mystery crates which contained a random item or a super rare hat. Valve ended up earning so much in revenue from this move that a mere 9 months later they made the game free to play, which, as we know, simply enables even more people access to the cash shop. Before we move on from here, it's worth noting that this didn't kill Team Fortress 2. If anything, it put the game in a stronger position than it had ever been in before, keeping the player base alive while enriching Valve all the while. We've got a separate video analyzing why Team Fortress 2 is in a tight spot at the moment, but it's not because of microtransactions or the free-to-play model at least. We're still getting to where that became a problem. I suspect Team Fortress 2 wasn't badly affected by the addition of an economy because it was something that was glued onto a game that was already good. The problem starts to come into play a bit more when games are being developed for the express purpose of a cash shop through which to make money. Few games provide us with a better example of what started happening in the AAA games industry than 2017's Star Wars Battlefront 2. The original 2004 Battlefront game was beloved by many, and hope was high that the new games would live up to the legacy of the old. But when Battlefront 2 released, it was immediately clear to all its players that EA's top priority was not to make a good game, but to coerce their players into giving them as much money as possible. The single-player campaign felt like a strapped-on afterthought, and the progression was heavily based on random loot crates purchased with earnable credits. To make matters worse, there was a cooldown timer on credit collection from arcade mode, and some of Star Wars' most iconic heroes and villains were locked away behind a huge credit price tag. This meant that you'd either have to spend many grueling hours grinding your way through the game before you'd ever have enough credits to unlock someone like Darth Vader. Some smart Redditors calculated that it would actually take an average of 40 hours to unlock a single hero or villain if you saved every last credit you earned. Alternatively, you could invest around $22 to $30 and unlock one of them immediately, granting you an edge over players who had yet to unlock that character. The backlash was immense. So much so that one Reddit thread in particular gained a lot of attention. The poster complained that even in 2017, the age of microtransactions had gone too far, and they were upset that after spending $80 on the game, Darth Vader was a locked character. EA actually replied to this post, not to apologize, but to justify their development decisions. It's pretty telling that this reply currently holds the Guinness World Record for the most downvoted comment on Reddit, with over 667,000 downvotes. Yeesh. There are many more examples I could point to, but our story must go a different direction. Point is, if you have eyes at all, then you've likely seen firsthand in one game or another how actual fun and good quality gameplay has taken a back seat so that a glorified casino can be plopped in front of you. My final example is actually the one that saddens me the most. StarCraft 2 is a fantastic real-time strategy game loaded with content. It was created by Blizzard Entertainment and released in 2010. It was the fastest-selling strategy game of all time, selling 3 million copies in the first month with a $50 price tag. It would go on to sell over 6 million copies before going free-to-play in November 2017, ensuring it would see a fresh injection of players and exposing them to the game's purchasable expansion packs and cosmetics. Regardless, it's a game with an excellent campaign, a beloved story, a fantastic multiplayer system allowing for cooperative or competitive play, and it's often heralded as a masterpiece in its genre. It's a game that started development in 2003, though development was paused for a year, but that means that it spent at least 6 years in development. Now, we don't know exactly what it cost them to make this game, so it's difficult to work out what kind of profit Blizzard made from this, but it must have brought in at least $225 million in revenue before going free-to-play based on the sales, and that's not counting expansions and microtransactions. So what makes this a sad story? Former Blizzard developer Jason Hall, now an indie game developer and streamer, revealed that despite him and doubtlessly many others working overtime for 2 years straight to make StarCraft 2 a reality, Blizzard made more money from a single cosmetic item in World of Warcraft. This item was the Celestial Steed, a simple mount skin that cost $25 when it was added to World of Warcraft back in April 2010. It's a staggering realization to think about. The wiki tells us that in 2008 there were 40 developers working on StarCraft 2. There were 5 managers, 14 programmers, 10 artists, and a bunch of designers. By By 2009, the team was up to 60 members in addition to 58 unique voice actors. Imagine you're the head of a game studio or publisher. Take a look at this list of job titles and associated salaries at Blizzard as of 2020. How much money can you afford to spend on that team? How long will it take you to see your vision realized, and how much will you have to spend on marketing alone just to get it out there? Is it really worth the risk to you? Or would you rather just design a low-poly 3D model of a sparkly horse to go in your existing game and call it a day? It's no wonder that AAA studios we used to love just aren't making great games like they used to. The vast majority of them are publicly traded companies with shareholders and a board of directors who have an interest in making money. Why would they ever direct the publishers and developers beneath them to do something that carried greater risk if it was so much easier just to push for microtransaction models instead? A lot of game design decisions are being made based on market data and social engineering methods to get players to spend as much as possible. Even if the actual programmers who build these games aren't happy about it, their hands are tied because the order comes from the top. It doesn't matter if gameplay or story suffer for it, the money comes first. Now look, we've painted a pretty bleak picture here, but it's not so black and white as you'll soon see. Not every board of directors is a bunch of evil hyper-capitalist suits, not every major company has to answer to such specific orders, and while they can be tone-deaf, they're not all idiots. There are boards of directors out there that realize that no matter how well they optimize their game for spending, players won't spend money in it if the game itself sucks. But optimizing for maximum profits through microtransactions, while prevalent, is far from the only issue with the AAA gaming scene. The wrong leadership team in a publisher or studio can also be what destroys the quality of an otherwise good game. A lot of us are used to seeing real-world political or social justice issues become a part of game development in ways that affect the creative direction of a game, and that's before we even touch on the optimization issues that are also so prevalent. An example of this would be the original Super Mario Bros. The whole game had to fit on a 40 kilobyte cartridge. This image of the game you're looking at right now is 390 kilobytes, nearly 10 times that size. The developers had to be clever and utilize every trick they could think of to bring the size of the game down so that it would fit. But you'll rarely see that level of dedication from developers today. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, the version released in 2023, takes up nearly 200 gigabytes of storage thanks to poor optimization, and Activision just doesn't seem to care, their latest excuse just being that there's a lot of content. And it's not just size that poor optimization affects, it's also the game's performance. Cyberpunk 2077 had an infamously terrible launch in December 2020. Star Wars Jedi Survivor in 2023 suffered from a slew of issues related to rendering, shaders, and scaling. The latest travesty is the new Dragon's Dogma 2, where you're likely to experience performance issues even with some of the best PC hardware on the market. So whether it's microtransactions, bad leadership, politics, or just general quality and optimization, any of these factors can be responsible for the game becoming a dumpster fire. But there's still one more which remains my personal pet peeve of all of these problems, and that's the skill of the actual individuals working on the game. That might seem like an obvious thing to say, but take a look at the Far Cry series, for example. The mainline games, not the spin-offs. The first Far Cry was developed by Crytek and published by Ubisoft. But Far Cry 2's development was led by Ubisoft Montreal. In fact, this was also true for Far Cry 3 and 4, but for Far Cry 5, Ubisoft Montreal were working with Ubisoft Toronto, and for Far Cry 6, Ubisoft Toronto were taking the lead for the first time. In almost all cases, the main team also had help from the wider global team. Now, this is not a burn on Ubisoft. I like Ubisoft, and I like the Far Cry series. Though my favorite game in it was Far Cry 2, Fight Me, this is, however, a good example of just how the development process is seldom ever going to be the same twice. Far Cry 2, the first game in the series developed by Ubisoft, was released in 2008. Far Cry 6, meanwhile, came out in 2021. That's 13 years between those two titles. Do you know how much these studios are changing in that time? How much the world or technology we use is changing? How many times has the economy crashed? How many rounds of layoffs have happened? How many people have left their positions, been moved to new ones, promoted, and so on? To hammer home just how big the difference between one game and another can be, I've looked at Far Cry 3 released in 2012 and Far Cry 4 released in 2014. These games have only a 2-year gap between them. Both were developed primarily by Ubisoft Montreal. So I took a look at the credits of each game, focusing specifically on the role of design at Ubisoft Montreal in each game. For just the design roles at Ubisoft Montreal, it seemed 56 people were involved for Far Cry 3, and of those 56, only 12 made it onto the new team in the same roles as before for Far Cry 4, which seemed like it had a much larger team working on it overall. To the people playing these games, one Far Cry title looks much like another. There are a lot of similarities between them, as one would hope of a series of games, but it's worth noting next time you see your favorite trusted studio announce a new game that it may be an entirely different team of people working on it compared to the team who worked on the games you liked and remembered. If you want an example of where the change in team led to a significant decrease in the quality of the end product, look no further than the Battlefield franchise by DICE and EA. Typically, indie games are where you want to look if you seek to avoid a lot of the issues in the AAA gaming sphere. Most indie games are either made by a small team on a low budget, or in some cases by a single individual. It's common that they'll be crowdfunded or simply produced in the spare time of the people that are working on the game while they work on other jobs. Occasionally, one will land a deal with a big publisher, looking at you, Devolver Digital, and that usually works out great for everyone, as the small indie studio gets the big marketing push from the publisher, and we get a game that was designed based on the vision of a small team. That's not to say that indie games can do no wrong, just that they're becoming more and more a mark of quality in an industry that seems to be swimming in its own filth. But Helldivers 2 is not an indie game, is it? Its developers reported in February that they're a small team of around 100 people, and following the success of Helldivers 2, they've been looking to hire more. 100 people is a bit of a large team to be working on an indie game, but it's a far cry from AAA if you consider that, as of 2022, there were over 3,000 people working on Call of Duty. Still, we shouldn't ignore the publisher backing, as both Helldivers 1 and 2 were published by Sony. The first game released to PlayStation 3, 4, and Vita in March 2015, and in December it became the first game Sony would publish for Windows, making its way over to PC as well. Helldivers 2, therefore, is one of those titles that fits rather snugly in the AA space, somewhere between indie and AAA. But all of this is just fluff. For the uninitiated, Helldivers 2 is a third-person, squad-based shooter where you play as one of many Helldivers battling to win an intergalactic struggle to rid the galaxy of the rising alien threats. But Helldivers 2 is not free. On top of being quite expensive, it's also a live service game with microtransactions. To top it off, it launched to mixed reviews on Steam due to crashing and technical issues. Given the checklist of things we've just gone over that are ruining the industry, on paper one would have expected Helldivers 2 to be the king of the turds. So why isn't it? Why is it still, at the time of writing, just over 2 months since it released, the 6th most played game on Steam right now? How did they manage to recover their review scores, and why aren't we all up in arms about it? The simple reason is that Arrowhead Game Studios have proven once and for all that it doesn't matter if your game releases with technical issues, microtransactions, and a hefty price tag, provided you show a commitment to the people who are buying your game. Show them that they're going to get their money's worth out of it because they deserve it, and not just so that you can check a box and tell them they'll get a new season pass every 3 months. Here's how this looks with practical steps. If your game launches with issues, then focus on fixing them, and quickly at that. Arrowhead jumped on patching Helldivers 2 so that the technical issues wouldn't get in the way of actually enjoying the game they had made. How long did it take Bethesda to fix Fallout 76's technical issues? And what about the financials? Most of you already know this, but most online games require servers. These servers cost money to run, money that's paid by the developers. Palworld was recently a massive indie success, and after selling a fantastic 12 million copies, they found their server costs were running to $500,000 a month, or $6 million per year if they keep them up at that rate. That's the cost of dedicated servers. Given that's the case, you might think that's why Helldivers 2 has such a high price tag and microtransactions, because they've got to pay for the server fees, right? Well, not quite in their case. Helldivers 2 is a peer-to-peer game, which means that when you join another player's squad or they join yours, one of you actually becomes the host, with your computer doing the hosting. Arrowheads still need to record how much loot you get on missions, what items you have in your inventory, and track player progress on the map among other things, so it's not like they have no costs at all, but they will be significantly less than if they had dedicated servers. This has made a few people quite mad, as peer-to-peer networking can be unstable depending on your computer or network setup, and in addition to that, it looks like an especially greedy move not to give players dedicated servers. But this couldn't be further from the truth. As it happens, there's another extremely popular online game that uses the peer-to-peer networking model and which has stood the test of time already. Yes, Warframe was one of the first Western games to bet everything they had on the free-to-play model, and it has quite an incredible success story. Maybe we'll do a video on it sometime, but that's otherwise a topic for another day. The point here is that if Warframe could succeed with microtransactions and peer-to-peer networking, then it definitely shouldn't be a problem for Helldivers 2. The big difference here is that Warframe is free-to-play, so if Digital Extremes takes a long time to update the game or add things, well, it's not like you paid for the game anyway. Helldivers 2 on the other hand has an entry cost, so with all of the money they've made on sales and microtransactions, you'd expect them to be paying an extreme level of attention to the game, providing upkeep for it on a daily basis and always thinking of their next move. This is typically where we'd see a AAA studio fail. Either they'd pocket the money and neglect their player base, or they make promises to add and fix things in the future which never come true. In some cases they'll charge you $70 for a barely finished game with no real content in it. But not Arrowhead Studios. Not only did they release a finished game with a fun gameplay loop and decent content, they released it with a game master. Those of you more familiar with tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons are no doubt familiar with the role of a Dungeon Master or Game Master. This title is often abbreviated to DM or GM. It's someone who narrates the story, tells you what happens to your characters, controls the bad guys, and keeps the game moving. Their job is ultimately to ensure that everyone is having fun and to help the players keep their momentum. A good game master will always be plotting out a new story path, new adventures for their players to go on. They'll be lovingly adding to the story based on the actions of the player characters, hiding secrets for them to find, and making sure that the game never gets stale. There's a reason that at least one D&D game has lasted for over 40 years. So Arrowhead Studios took this concept and rolled with it. They've employed someone whose actual role is to be a game master, a man named Joel. Joel's full-time job is to do all those typical game master things for the players of Helldivers 2. The CEO of Arrowhead even said that Dungeons & Dragons was a major inspiration for them in creating Helldivers 2, and that it was important that they could replicate the collaborative and reactive storytelling of Dungeons & Dragons, adapting the model to work for millions of players instead of a small group. This is, in my opinion, the biggest factor for the success of Helldivers 2, and I think it's going to keep Helldivers 2 alive a lot longer than most people realize. Take Warhammer 40k Darktide for example. The Warhammer level design was beautiful and really immersed fans in the setting. The music and visuals were impressive, the characters likable, and the gameplay was fun. Fatshark even went back a year after the game released to drop an update overhauling a bunch of the classes and making them even more fun to play. So why does the game have mixed reviews on Steam? Why was its all-time peak player count less than a quarter of Helldivers 2's numbers, and less than half of the current 24-hour peak? More importantly, why does it only have around 3,000 people still playing it? The simple answer is, in spite of everything they did do for Darktide, Fatshark simply didn't do enough. The community needed updates, but updates never came, and when they did, little changed. Not only did they not fulfill all the promises they made on release, but progress toward them felt hollow and empty. Maybe that'll change soon with the big Path of Redemption update, which they say will be out by the end of April, with Fatshark claiming they've reinvented the penance system, cut down on the grind, and gone to efforts to make the game more engaging. I guess we'll wait and see. On the topic of Darktide, it's interesting that Helldivers 2's mission selection map actually looks something similar to what Darktide features. But in truth, they couldn't be any more different. Darktide's mission selection menu is just that, a menu. It has little to no consequence on the game as a whole. But in Helldivers 2, that couldn't be further from the truth. Instead, even this menu is a means of delivering the game's ongoing developing story. It's the status marker for the galactic war around which the game is centered, and Joel, the game master, is constantly interfering with it. The whole war is itself a product of careful planning and storytelling by Joel, pulling all of the strings behind the scenes. This is why just 1 week into the game's launch, when we were all busy fighting the Terminids, there was suddenly an automaton invasion on the opposite end of the galaxy. As part of Joel's roadmap, there are a lot of twists and turns that we can expect to see, and all of them are being kept secret until then as a surprise. As a quick side note, this is another thing that I think adds to the magic of what makes Helldivers 2 feel so special: the unexpected. I can't tell you how many games I've played expecting to discover something new, something amazing that the developers had hidden away, only to find nothing. I remember exploring the vast expanse of space in Elite Dangerous, wondering if enough players went exploring, we might find something amazing had been put there to find. But alas, there was just nothing. Lethal Company is an example of a pretty good game that does have a bunch of scary monsters in it, but once you learn what they are and what they do, that initial magic wears off and it's just the recognized enemy again. You get used to it and eventually you get comfortable with it, but not Helldivers 2. They'll just drop major new content into the game for the sake of surprising you, because why not? And it works. It works extremely well for that matter. In the later stages of this game, you really never know what will happen. You may be among the first squads to discover a brand new enemy type or a new vehicle. And it's not just Joel game mastering to make this happen, there are a team of minor game masters, a bunch of real people over at Arrowhead Studios busy watching your games. Not every game, but they're jumping between a significant number of them, or they have some tool to manipulate lots of games at once, and they actually change the game as you play it. Sometimes they'll drop in a power-up for you to use, or sometimes they'll make your level more challenging. Human game masters can do something an AI just can't do, and that's narrate an epic scene as it folds out in a way that makes it even more memorable. If you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons with a good DM, you know that this is exactly what it feels like when all the pieces come together and you get to have your moment. Everything about Helldivers 2 buys into this, right from the gameplay all the way down to the wacky storyline. Even the gunplay, like how easy it is to zap your own squad with a lightning cannon, is intentional, as Arrowhead's CEO likened it to stories of players accidentally hitting their party with fireballs in Dungeons & Dragons. Oh, and the mystery I was talking about, it doesn't stop with the new discoveries the game masters give you. Here's another thing I'm sick of in modern online gaming: established metas. Got a game with 500 interesting and cool weapons? Too bad only 100 of them are viable, and in reality only 4 of them are established meta. Either do the hard grinding to get the meta equipment, or feel like a sad and sorry loser as you get kicked out of parties for having the wrong equipment. Most games don't need to be out for more than a month before everything there is to know is plastered on 6 different wikis and 37 different build websites. Incidentally, some Helldiver 2 players have tried to do this here and been rebuked for it, because in Helldivers 2, developers figured that some players would use the 4 displayed weapon statistics as a be-all end-all, and again, the CEO of Arrowhead came out and told us that each gun has around 50 stat points in total, so there were always about 46 secret statistics influencing a weapon. He said the intention behind this is that you use the one that you like the most and not the one that the stat charts say is the best. Folks, it may seem like a simple thing, but it breaks the mold. It goes against just about everything that all modern AAA games are doing, and I love it. If you want your established meta and your one perfect build, go play one of the other 9 million games that ask for 200 hours of grinding before you're allowed to enjoy them. Anyway, my point behind all of this is that Arrowhead Studios have done an absolutely incredible job of ensuring that this game will not only survive and thrive, but that everyone playing it will feel like they're part of the global community effort to the game's main mission as they all buy into the story together. This is what Arrowhead is using their money for, and I'll add that their monetization means are extremely generous. Another thing that Arrowhead CEO said is that games have to earn the right to monetize rather than force it on their audience, and that's exactly what they've done. With just a standard amount of gameplay, you can easily unlock enough premium currency to purchase everything in the game that would otherwise be available by microtransactions, so not only is it totally unnecessary to spend money, but you really won't even feel pressured to. There's no pay to win on the things you get either, as most of the weapons are side grades rather than direct upgrades. To ensure there'll never be any pressure or fear of missing out, Arrowhead have also ensured that as they add war bonds to the game, essentially battle passes, they'll never remove them and you can simply accumulate them over time. On that last point, here's something else I think is pretty important. All of us have lives aside from gaming. Whether that's school, sports, a job, time spent with friends or family, learning new skills, doing stuff outdoors, we've all got a limited number of hours in a day. Most AAA games with dedicated servers don't just want you to spend those limited hours playing them, they need you to do it. Because if you don't, you won't be spending money in them and they'll slowly waste away. This model works when your audience has nothing better to do, but ask yourself this. How many games typically require you to spend thousands of hours playing them to make it to any kind of appreciable endgame? Or if not thousands, at least many hundreds. And for how many of those hours are you legitimately having fun? Not just repeating some mindless boring task to farm or grind for something. All the while you have your guide open in the background or your podcast or YouTube videos running just to help you pass the hours away. How many games like that can you reasonably play at the same time? It brings me great pleasure to say that Helldivers 2 is simply not one of them. Some people enjoy a marathon session, but Helldivers 2 has an almost old-school attitude about it. You never feel like you absolutely need to sit down and play now or you'll miss out, and you don't feel guilty for taking breaks or doing other stuff because the game is simply fun at all stages. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I think that's the part I want to end it on. Helldivers 2 is pure, distilled, chaotic fun. There's not a single time I've been shot out of my pod on my ship that I haven't had a massive big smile on my face. This game may not be a power fantasy like Warframe, but if there's one thing it is exceedingly good at, it's making you feel cool. The setting, the art, the music, all of it comes together in this big crescendo of camaraderie and cinematic action hero energy. Until other AAA studios learn that at the end of the day, fun matters more than your business model, they'll continue to see Helldivers 2 and other games like it take the spotlight again and again. And you know what? That doesn't bother me at all. If you enjoyed this video or you want to see more analytical content like this, consider leaving a like or subscribe and comment what you think we should take a closer look at next time. Otherwise, if you have some video ideas for us or are just keen to hang out in a community of gamers, be sure to check out our Discord server and connect with the community at Realm Space Gaming. My name is Jason, thanks for watching, and don't forget to enjoy the rest of your day.